Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and I'm proud of it. Nothing that I'm about to say has been reviewed by my agency or any other agency of the federal government. Part of the reason is because even I don't know what I'm about to say. I'd like to talk about a couple subjects today, and one of the subjects deals with the FAA and the grounding of ValueJet. And there's a lot of details about that. I'm not going to get into the details of the violations that were found and so on and so forth. Apparently, 34 violations were found on ValueJet, and a lot of experts say that the kind of violations they found were nothing particularly important or really noteworthy, and that if there wasn't a national crisis and a tremendous political uproar over the whole thing, that and they had found these particular violations, they probably wouldn't have shut ValueJet down. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. As you know, there was a crash on a ValueJet jet that crashed into the Everglades, and on that jet there was some kind of crisis or fire. Everybody was killed, 110 people. They've had a grisly time going out there and finding the bodies in this horrible swamp. And the situation was just grim and horrible. And apparently in the course of the investigation, they found that there were oxygen generators that were used up and that were being transported back to the home base of the airline on that particular flight. And they think that those were mislabeled or somehow inspected, and that maybe some of the documents may have been altered, or maybe they said that they were okay when they weren't. Now, ValueJet is one of these companies that doesn't do their own aircraft inspecting and doesn't do their own maintenance. They outsource that. Of course, outsourcing is a big to-do and a big subject in corporations right now, and even the government is outsourcing, and they're outsourcing some depots like in McClellan Air Force Base. So obviously ValueJet had various subcontractors, and the question has now come up, were these subcontractors reviewed properly? Did the government do enough to guarantee safety in the airlines? And I think that this is very ironic, because up to now, the past 6 months, or at least with 2 years really, since 1994, when the Republicans really controlled the agenda and the debate. Everybody said, gee, these federal workers and these pointy-headed bureaucrats, all this regulation was just driving everybody nuts. Nobody can do business. Nobody can get anything done, because all over the place are these federal bureaucrats running around with their little regulations, creating regulation after regulation, making it impossible to do business. Now that there's been a disaster, everybody's running around screaming, what did the FAA do? Where was the FAA? How come federal inspectors didn't find this? How come federal inspectors didn't find that? Were they tough enough? Has the FAA combined two missions? One, the mission of promoting the airlines. Is that compatible with the responsibility to guarantee safety? Now, a lot of people don't realize how the FAA works. And the FAA works in a different way until recently, because the rest of the government is going the FAA way. I think this is very interesting as far as inspecting is concerned. In the DOD, up to a few years ago, basically federal inspectors went out there and re-inspected or watched over inspections, pulled data from the contractor, and actually participated in the inspection process to guarantee that military goods were really good and that they worked and that they passed inspection, that they were worth accepting. And basically the government inspectors and the Defense Department accept the goods that are delivered to the military. And this is true in a lot of different agencies of the government. Now, until recently, they've changed that, and they've changed that to go to the way the FAA does business. And basically what the FAA inspectors do, they don't inspect the planes, they don't inspect the maintenance of the planes, they make sure that the system is working, not inspecting the planes themselves, because that's considered, what's the word I'm looking for? It's considered redundant effort, because obviously the plane and the airline has their own inspectors, and their inspectors inspect the planes. So why have a double inspection? Why have a completely redundant inspection system? It's only something that's absolutely fail-safe, and that if it fails, hundreds of people will be killed. Now, instead, what they do is they inspect the system. They make sure that the system is working. And that is a concept that's gaining ground throughout the Defense Department and a lot of other agencies of the federal government, and even into private industry, where ISO 9000, which is this international standard for quality that's being put forward by the Europeans and is being accepted now by many businesses within the United States, where a third-party auditor comes in and inspects the system, makes sure that the company follows its own procedures, and that's basically follows an approved procedure. And that's basically what the FAA does. And that system is gradually being used by the Defense Department, NASA, the GAO or the GSA, which is the General Services Administration that runs the federal buildings and buys goods for other government agencies. And that's becoming the standard, really, for the methodology to do inspection, to inspect the system. And if the quality system is quality and is a quality system, a quality system, so to speak, then the products that are produced by it are going to be quality products. At least that's the theory behind it. Now we have a situation where the company outsourced the inspection, outsourced the maintenance, and some of the records may not have been kept properly. The FAA's been going in there. They've been finding some problems. They've been suggesting corrective action, and ValueJet's been doing it. But now that there's been a disaster, ValueJet's been closed down for 30 days, and maybe even longer. We don't really know. And maybe opened up for fewer than the number of planes that they're running now, which of course would be a tremendous drag of cash flow from these companies. Now the other thing that this inspection system does, one of the things they look for is to see whether everybody is qualified to do their jobs. And that's another issue that's been coming out of the ValueJet situation. Are these pilots qualified to pilot those particular planes? And of course, they seem to be finding out that some of the pilots don't seem to have all of the records and don't seem to have a in record or recorded proof that they've taken all of the different classes and tests and certifications and whatever else that they need to fly the specific plane that they were in. And there's talk that they may not let that particular company fly as many planes they're flying now. Now, I don't know whether that's going to come true or not. But I think it's very, very ironic that people that just 6 months ago and a year ago and 2 years ago were screaming and yelling, we've got to get rid of this government oversight. We've got to get rid of these regulations. And we've got to get rid of these pointy-headed bureaucratic regulators, are now screaming, where were these pointy-headed bureaucratic regulators when we needed them? Something's gone wrong. And I've been predicting this for a long time, that sooner or later, the deregulation that's been going on in the SEC, the environmental arena, the FAA, the Defense Department, and everywhere else, that sooner or later something's going to happen. And all of a sudden, instead of screaming, let's get rid of these guys, they're going to be screaming, where were these guys when we needed them? Where was that oversight? Who's protecting the store? Is the fox protecting the hen house, or do we have a neutral third party? And how neutral is a government official? That all depends on what your point of view is. But he's certainly a little bit more neutral than somebody that's paid for by the company that is being reviewed and paid for by the company that's being inspected. Perhaps people would feel a little bit more secure if there was an outside regulator coming in. Now, there's been a lot of situations that have been coming up in the news on all these Dateline type shows about state regulation. There aren't enough regulators regulating in certain states to make sure that daycare centers are safe, and that they've been cutting the budgets and cutting out these inspectors. And I'm surprised. I mean, some of the opponents of this are coming forward and saying, well, we don't need all this regulation. Who needs that? Why should these small businessmen who take care of people's children during the day, why should they be harassed and bugged? Shouldn't the buyer beware? And I have articles over here about rogue brokers and the brokerage industry who've been taking people's life savings and taking them right down the drain with them. And people say, well, who needs these regulators? Why do they need the regulators? But then when they hear about a story about somebody whose life savings has been completely done away with, they say, where was the regulation? Where were the people that were supposed to protect us? What were they doing? How come they didn't do that better? And how come there aren't more of them? How come we don't have a budget for them? How come we don't have these people on the job? And how come if they are on the job, they're not doing a good enough job to protect me and to protect my family and the people that I care about? And I think this is very important. I'm going to be looking at more and more of these issues as things come up. Now, I admit the ValueJet crash was a terrible tragedy. And whether that was the fault of the FAA, one of the top administrators, person in charge of safety for the FAA, resigned. And he was kind of forced out, but technically he resigned by himself on his own. And the heads rolled because things weren't good. And people want that kind of regulation. They want regulators out there inspecting planes, or at least inspecting systems, but making sure they're safe. They don't care how those systems are inspected, but they want to make sure that there's somebody who's not paid for by the airlines that's out there making sure that they are safe. And similarly, they want to make sure that the rogue brokers are brought under control, and that fraud artists are brought under control, and that nobody's going to go over there, sell them a bill of goods, and steal their life savings away from them when they're trying to protect themselves. And that's true in a lot of different agencies and a lot of different industries where people really are out there and they're very, very, very much at risk. And they don't see anybody out there within the industry really protecting them. And that is a real issue. And that's a lot of the reason that a lot of the regulation came about in the first place. Because something came up, there was a scandal, there was a terrible circumstance, and boom, Congress was under a lot of pressure, and they passed a law, and they said not only will there be regulation, because they didn't really know what it was, but we're going to authorize an agency to create regulation, the aim of which is going to protect this group or this person or that person from this threat. And in the case of the FAA, the threat was crashes. In the case of the FCC, the threat was disruption of the broadcast lines. And just about everything else. In the case of the EPA, the Love Canal situation, some other situations had come up, and people wanted to be protected from those that would despoil the environment. And they wanted to be protected from those that would dirty the air and destroy the cleanliness of the water and put toxic waste into the environment one way or the other. And that's been very, very clear that when those kind of things are identified, Congress has had a tendency to create an agency and to say, make this better, protect those people. And a lot of those agents and a lot of those federal government workers and a lot of the pointy-headed bureaucrats or whatever you want to call them have gone simply too far. They've shut down entire industries to try to protect the environment. And one example that caused a lot of pain, but in fact has improved the environment, is hard coal. Hard coal has a lot of sulfur in it. And high sulfur dirties the environment, dirties the air, creates smog. And that industry is virtually gone. There's hardly any hard coal mines open. Soft coal is another story. It seems to be doing much better. And natural gas replaced a lot of the hard coal. But there's an instance where regulators went out and virtually shut down the industry. They basically said that those plants that create electricity by burning hard sulfur or hard coal or high sulfur coal either would have to go through such extent to an expense to make sure that their product was clean, or use some other substance, and they did. And that's pretty much what happened. A lot of mines closed down. A lot of communities suffered as a result. And that's the kind of thing that's been going on. Now, around 1994, the tide began to turn, and the people elected a Republican Congress, and I have no problem with the people electing whoever they want to make whatever laws and regulations they want, or to remove whatever laws and regulations they want, and then have the federal worker come out and enforce those laws and regulations. That's how our system works. But apparently a lot of people think that the Republicans went too far, and that some of their stands to get rid of environmental laws and regulations and cut the budgets of various agencies like the FAA and the FCC and others, and to open up and deregulate some industries like deregulate the communications industry, deregulate the finance industry, that maybe they've gone too far, and that maybe we're not being protected. And as these various scandals and disasters have been coming up, people have been coming to that conclusion more and more and more. And who they turn to? Well, they certainly haven't turned to business. Nobody's running around saying, well, everything's okay, because I know ValueJet would never do anything to hurt us. And people are saying, no, we wanted the federal government to come forward, and we wanted the federal inspectors to come there and to protect us. We don't expect ValueJet to protect us. We don't trust ValueJet to protect us. And apparently, at least at that one moment, ValueJet wasn't there and wasn't protecting them. And maybe that's easier for the protected industries, even though they have this guy on their tail and they have this regulation that they have to follow. At least everybody else has to follow the same regulation. Republicans got into a big jam when they tried to ease up and loosen up federal mandates to the states to have standards for elderly home centers and elderly nursing homes and so on and so forth. And people just had a fit, how could you get rid of that? How could you be so cold? And they said, well, we don't need federal regulation. The states will take care of it themselves. But people didn't trust that, and that was overturned. So sometimes people do want some bureaucrat, some inspector, somebody to come in there and guarantee their safety, guarantee that their meat is inspected, guarantee that there's no fecal matter on the chickens, and that the chickens are bacteria-free when people buy them in the store, and the food and drugs and so on and so forth. One of the odd turn of events is that they deregulated the herbal industry, which, when people think about it, seems very new age and kind of liberal. Here's this big industry over here, people that hawk herbs of various kinds. Now people are all up in arms because there's an herb that has a substance called ephedrine, which is also used for asthma and some other things, but which in its natural form is actually within an herb, and it's an active ingredient for a certain herb in a plant, and they've done it, and it basically is a form of upper, and they're marketing this as a legal herb. And a couple people with heart problems and so on and so forth died. People are saying, how dare they market this herb and allow private industry to come forward and hurt people? 15 people died over a period of a couple of years. Of course, hundreds of thousands have died of smoking-related illness, so I'm not sure that that's really as big a deal as they made. But they basically said, how could they deregulate this? Where are the regulators? Where are the federal regulators and inspectors? And how come they haven't protected our children from this terrible herb? And I'm not sure whether it's that terrible or not, but that's the outcry that happened, again, after a scandal and a tragedy, after a few people died from ingesting this herb when they didn't have, or they had a medical problem that this herb would affect negatively. So a lot of this deregulation has been going on the last 4 years, and the last 6 years, and the last 8 years. Really, the movement started during the Reagan administration. And basically the idea is people can take care of themselves. If private industry puts out an unsafe product, or somebody doesn't have a lot of integrity, their competitors will bring that to the attention of the public and will stop it. And very clearly the public doesn't think that that's enough of a check and a balance to protect the American people, and that there really has to be some form of regulation either by the states or by the federal government. And in some cases people don't have that big a problem with having some reasonable regulation. And I'm against regulation that's unreasonable, and I think that there has been some regulation that's unreasonable. But it seems like we have this tremendous pendulum that goes back and forth. Either let's hang all these guys and let's just completely get rid of all these regulators and all these inspectors and all these pointy-headed bureaucrats, or let's just inspect everything to death. Let's go out there and hire twice as many FAA inspectors, and let's let them go back and make them inspect planes instead of systems, even though the system of inspecting systems has really worked pretty well until very recently. And I really don't know. I think that that's a political decision. That's a decision that you have to make out there by electing the people that you elect to Congress, electing the president who will sign the legislation or not, and then the federal worker will go out there and he'll enforce whatever laws and regulations that the people that you've elected have passed. That's how the democratic system is supposed to work, and that's why we have a representative republic. And the federal worker is out there just carrying out the laws and regulations of the people that you've elected. And a lot of people don't like those. A lot of people don't like, in the airline industry, don't like these FAA guys in there telling them what to do and patting themselves on the back and making themselves seem quite important. And then again, a lot of people don't like the fact that FAA inspectors said that an airline was safe, which a lot of people feel is not safe. And that's a big problem. And that's something that's going to be coming up again and again and again as we suffer from various industries that have been deregulated, and there may be abuses as a result of the deregulation. After all, the S&Ls were deregulated in the 1980s, and they grew into the biggest mess that cost about $500 billion, $500 billion, and while the RTC is no longer liquidating the assets of these closed S&Ls, it's a problem that's still been rearing its head. And I think it's very, very interesting that the state charges against Charles Keating, the head of Lincoln Savings, who put out phony bonds and persuaded his people to sell bonds that he knew were not guaranteed by the federal government, and presented as guaranteed by the federal government as a non-risky investment, which were in fact a tremendously risky investment. When the Lincoln Savings went down, its parent company went down, the $300 million of these bonds, the value disappeared instantly, and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people lost their life savings all at once. And Charles Keating, apparently the state charges against him have been lifted for one reason or another. And now he's appealing the federal charges by saying that the jury pool was tainted by the knowledge that he was convicted in state court. So apparently an appeals court, federal appeals court, is considering another trial for Charles Keating. So I think it's ironic that the ultimate offender of a non-regulated industry is coming back to haunt us, and his issue is coming back at a time when we have this ValueJet situation. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Thank you all for watching, and I hope that you watch me next week. Thank you very much.